This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 692 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. One of the most interesting stories of this fantasy football season is something that I talked about on the 10 Trends episode earlier this week. It's Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, and Patrick Mahomes. It's those four quarterbacks separating themselves so far from the pack. They become insanely valuable in single quarterback fantasy football. I've written a lot about the quarterback position in fantasy. It's how I got my start in this industry. It's how the late round branding was born. So let's talk about this phenomenon a little bit. To reiterate some of the stuff that I said on the 10 Trends episode, those four quarterbacks are giving you a bigger edge so far through 5 weeks than any other group of four have given you basically in fantasy football history. That's not compared to how those other quarterbacks performed through 5 weeks though. What I'm saying is, if this continues, more on that in a second. Now, I've mostly backed away from the late round quarterback strategy over the last few years. It hasn't been as necessary. I've podcasted about this shift in quarterback. I've written about it. I broke it down in detail in the late round draft guide. Quarterback has become more predictable in fantasy football. And by predictable, I mean the market has done a really good job in recent years at picking out which quarterbacks are going to be good. Truthfully, the actual points scored edge that top quarterbacks have given you versus replacement level quarterbacks hasn't dramatically changed. What has dramatically changed is that the market has finally realized, basically since Lamar Jackson's MVP season, that rushing is important in fantasy football, that mobile quarterbacks matter. And so there are fewer late round breakouts. That then drives up the need to get a quarterback early, because there's still some edge being had at quarterback. The difference so far in 2022 versus these other seasons is that there's this cluster of quarterbacks who are quite literally breaking fantasy football. There's a group of four who are providing such a significant edge over the rest of their position. And that's just driven teams to the top of their league standings. But here's the question I want to pose. Is it really that different? Like I said, when I talked about how the top four quarterbacks were giving you this huge edge in points scored, I compared that to how quarterbacks historically had done across the entire season. That's not really an apples to apples comparison. An apples to apples comparison would be to see if we've seen this type of thing happen across the first 5 weeks of the season. So I dug into that question. I looked at every season since 2011, and I first analyzed specifically weeks 1 through 5. So after the first 5 weeks of the season, we have some sort of rankings list, or how quarterbacks rank after 5 weeks in points per game. This year, for example, Josh Allen is the QB1 in points per game with 29.3 points per contest. For the record, that's not the best points per game that we've seen from a QB1 after 5 weeks over the last decade. QB2 this year is at 26 points, QB3 25.8, and so on. I did that for every year since 2011. I removed the names. I simply focused on how the QB1 was scoring, how the QB2 was scoring, etc. Now, I wanted to compare that to some baseline. Baselines are really hard to define in fantasy football. Finding the replacement level player is no easy task. But how I defined baseline for this is pretty straightforward. I just looked at how each quarterback was performing against the average of QB10 to QB14. I'm not comparing across positions here. I'm simply looking at quarterback. So being precise with a baseline doesn't matter that much because this is all relative. We're not comparing how well a quarterback is doing versus his position to how well a running back is doing versus his position. But I chose a baseline that makes sense for a 12-team league. If you're looking at QB10 to QB14 and the average that those quarterbacks scored, you're likely capturing the worst hypothetical starter in a 12-team league. I understand that some leagues will have far worse quarterback play in a fantasy lineup. Some leagues won't. But it's still an intuitive baseline for an analysis like this. So we've got each quarterback and how well they scored from weeks 1 to 5. And now we have a baseline to compare that number to. So for example, Josh Allen, 29.3 points per game this year. This season, the QB10 to QB14 has averaged 16.5 points per game. So the difference between Allen and that baseline is a staggering 12.8 fantasy points. Now that's actually not the largest difference that we've seen through 5 weeks from a QB1 versus his baseline. That happened in 2013, actually, when Peyton Manning averaged 31 points per game to start the year. But Allen's start is the second best start by a QB1 versus his baseline. Our QB2 right now is Lamar Jackson. Jackson scored 26 points per game. That's 9.5 points better than the baseline. That's also the second best differential that we've seen since 2011 from a QB2. Now, as you go down the list, you notice that at each individual quarterback spot, we've seen this before. The difference is that we're seeing it all happen in one season. Let me put it this way. The average difference between QB1 to the baseline from 2011 to 2021, so excluding this year, has been 8.1 points. So you have a QB1 from a random season versus a baseline from a random season. The average that we've seen over the last decade has been 8.1 points. This year, like I said, Josh Allen versus his baseline is 12.8. That's a pretty significant difference. When it comes to QB2 versus the baseline from 2011 to 2021, the difference has been 7.5 points on average. This year, it's 9.5. At QB3, the average has been 6.9. This year, it's 9.3. At QB4, the difference has been 5.9. This year, it's 8.1. To put that all another way, those four quarterbacks are outperforming the baseline at a way better rate than what we typically see. But make no mistake, on an individual level, we've seen this before. We just haven't seen it happen with four quarterbacks like this. And then the QB5 hits. From 2011 to 2021, the QB5 versus the baseline has seen a difference of 5.8 points scored per game. This year, that number's 3.3. That's where the drop-off is occurring this year. That drop-off, though, has happened in different spots through the years. This year, it's after QB4. So the question then is, how sustainable is this? We've seen it happen before on an individual level. We saw Peyton Manning do better than how Josh Allen is doing this year. But how did those quarterbacks perform after week 5? Like, go back to Peyton Manning. He had 31 points per game through 5 weeks in 2013 when he threw 55 touchdown passes. He had 20 passing touchdowns through 5 games. What happened after that? You probably know the answer to this, but he fell off. It's not that he was bad for fantasy purposes, but after week 5, Manning averaged 23.1 fantasy points per game. And we see this happen frequently. The question we're asking here is, what happens after week 5 with these quarterbacks? That's what we're curious about here, right? How sustainable has this type of production been historically? During this time frame of 2011 to 2021, we've seen 44 instances where a quarterback was outperforming his baseline by 5 or more points after 5 weeks. Now that number 5 is completely arbitrary. I could look at 4, I could look at 6, but I chose 5 to give us a solid sample of quarterbacks who were playing well above expectation, or at least playing well above the rest of their position. Now of those 44, 42 of them were able to play at least 10 games after week 5. We had Dak Prescott get hurt in 2020. We had Deshaun Watson get hurt in 2017. So we can throw them out of our sample because they didn't play the second half of the season. Of the 42 quarterbacks, guess how many quarterbacks saw an increase in points per game from the front half of the year to the back half? So an increase in points per game after dominating weeks 1 through 5. 3 of the 42 did. 93% of these elite quarterbacks after week 5 saw their points per game drop. Now, that's not that surprising considering they're playing out of their minds to start the year, but it sheds light to working with small sample sizes. In our group of 42 quarterbacks who were awesome across the first 5 weeks, the average across the group was that they saw 81% of their week 1 to week 5 performance after week 5. Let me phrase that another way. Josh Allen right now, 29.3 points per game in a standard league. 81% of 29.3 is 23.7. So strictly based on recent history and nothing more, 23.7 is the points per game number that we might expect from Allen from here on out. Clearly, that's just an average. He may be at 98%, maybe 95% of his current points per game. All I'm doing here is explaining what's happened on average historically. And let's be real, if everything maintains with these baseline players, scoring 23.7 points per game is still really, really good. It's just not nearly the same type of performance that we've seen thus far. I also don't think that this means that Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson or Jalen Hurts or Patrick Mahomes, I don't think this means that they're sell candidates. A probable drop in points per game doesn't mean the player isn't good for fantasy. You still have to look at how the market feels about these players. But it's true that we do generally see something along these lines each year. It's just not as dramatic as it's been this season, because the mid-range QB1s this year really aren't great. That drop-off typically occurs a lot earlier. We have 4 quarterbacks who are crushing it when historically we might just get 1 or 2 of them. And the final point that I need to make with all of this ties back to what I said at the beginning. These were all non-late round quarterbacks. Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, and Patrick Mahomes were not drafted late. In the past, we've often seen these elite quarterbacks through 5 weeks come from the late rounds. It plays directly into the idea that I've been trying to get across over the last few years, that the market has gotten smarter. That's the real reason the late round quarterback strategy has completely morphed. Before getting to the mailbag questions this week, I want to remind you about the GMC Sierra Mountain Climber Pick'em, a free-to-play contest series that gives you a chance to win a share of $10,000 in FanDuel site credit every Sunday, courtesy of GMC. Here's how it works. Every Sunday during the NFL season, you'll have a chance to answer questions based on the day's 1 p.m. and 4:25 p.m. games. The more questions you answer correctly, the higher up the mountain you'll move. If during any week you answer every question correctly for a perfect score, you'll reach the summit and win your share of $10,000 in site credit. The contest series is now live, so head to fanduel.com/free/contest/GMC to start climbing the mountain. The first question this week is from Patreon, is from LP. It says, "Hey JJ, thanks for all you do." No problem. One player I haven't seen you talk a ton about is Devin Duvernay. Maybe I'm biased from playing in a league with return yardage scoring, but I feel like he's been a pretty safe floor with a great ceiling, and I've been playing him over guys like Thielen and Travis Etienne. Is he a player that you see value in rest of season, especially with Bateman's recent injury trouble? I mean, let's keep in mind that Bateman didn't play last week, and he was injured against Buffalo. I'm not sure I'd call Devin Duvernay a high floor play. Yes, he was wide receiver 9 in week 1, but he caught 2 touchdowns on 4 targets. He's had 1 touchdown since. And he's ranked higher than wide receiver 42 just once over his last 4 in PPR leagues. He's been wide receiver 72, 46, 42, and 26. And in that game as wide receiver 26, he was playing without Rashad Bateman. That was a more predictable performance. He had a target share of 26%. So as long as Bateman is out, sure, Duvernay's a decent play. But with Bateman, he doesn't have a very good floor. He averaged a target share per game rate of 11.5% in weeks 1 through 4. That's not going to cut it most weeks. The next question is from Twitter. It's from @FF_Jacob White, and it says, "How should we value Travis Etienne? Should we be worried that he hasn't taken over the backfield yet? Is he startable? Thanks, JJ." This is a classic case of coaching decisions driving the running back position in fantasy. If the Jags coaching staff doesn't want to give Travis Etienne the rock, then he's going to suffer in fantasy, flat out. But he probably should see the ball more in that offense. He's been better than James Robinson in every efficiency metric. I had Robinson as a sell in the 15 transaction show a couple of weeks ago, because not only was Jacksonville seeing amazing game scripts for him, but his secondary numbers really weren't looking good. And they still aren't. According to Number Fire's expected points model, among 50-plus rush attempt running backs, James Robinson is second worst in success rate. That measures the percentage of runs that resulted in positive expected points gains. Only Najee Harris is worse. Cam Akers and Joe Mixon are right ahead of James Robinson. And everyone is trashing those 3 running backs. Meanwhile, Travis Etienne has a success rate that's 12 percentage points higher. That's very, very significant. I want James Robinson to be good because he worked hard to come back from a devastating injury. But he was getting by on opportunity earlier this season. And if the coaching staff recognizes all of this, then Etienne could definitely get more work. And that would hurt Robinson. So I sort of lean by with Travis Etienne right now in case that shift happens. But again, this kind of stuff always comes down to a coaching decision. A player could be ineffective and still see the ball. And seeing the ball is what matters most in fantasy football. This next question is from Lefty Joe from Patreon. It says, Hey JJ, Josh Jacobs, number 9 rest of season. I'm having trust issues. Please help me overcome them. So my rest of season rankings are over on Patreon. Josh Jacobs right now is in the top 10 in those rest of season rankings. But he's really in a big tier of players. So technically, he could fall back to like 14th overall. Now, I don't want people to necessarily get caught up on that number because you don't have context for who he's ahead or who he's behind. What I do think is important to get across is something that I had mentioned on this show last week. I don't think people fully recognize how amazing Josh Jacobs' usage has been. And it's now been consistent. He's been a complete bell cow for the Raiders. And this isn't just a 1 week thing. It's been 3 weeks of Josh Jacobs seeing amazing work in that offense as a true bell cow. And he's producing. He's averaged 26.5 PPR points per game over his last 3. Anytime I get questions about rest of season rankings, I think a good exercise for the person asking that question is to ask themselves who should be ranked ahead of him. Who should be ranked ahead of Josh Jacobs? And not players in his same tier, because tiers to me mean that the players are relatively interchangeable in rank. He's in a tier with guys like Kelsey, Mixon, Fournette. I'm saying below him in a separate tier, especially at running back. Are you going to take Aaron Jones over Josh Jacobs, Alvin Kamara, DeAndre Swift? I mean, even Dalvin Cook, you could argue very strongly is a worse rest of season back than Josh Jacobs because of the snap share and the injury. Is it bold to have Jacobs in a tier with someone like Mixon, Fournette, Eckler? Maybe. Maybe that's what the market says. But we have to be somewhat reactive here. Maybe he reverts back to his week 1, week 2 usage. But it's certainly not trending that way. And I'm an aggressive fantasy manager too. And I practice what I preach. You can absolutely play it more safe than I would. But all signs point to Josh Jacobs being a very good fantasy back from here on out. We have to detach ourselves from how we might have felt before the season started. We're entering week 6. We have more evidence, so let's act on it. The next question is from Cam Kablam on Twitter, and it says, is Allen Robinson droppable at this point? So I think in a lot of leagues he probably is. But one thing I do want to throw out there with Allen Robinson, I think this is really, really important. The Rams' offensive line is a mess, and it's preventing them from really working down the field. Matthew Stafford this season has seen 12% of his yards come from 15-plus air yard throws. That number was almost 19% last year. So far this season, the Rams have faced the Bills, Falcons, Cardinals, 49ers, and Cowboys. According to Pro Football Reference, the Bills are 15th in pressure rate. The Cardinals are 16th. And by the way, both of those rankings dropped after this past week, but they're still top half in the league. The 49ers, they're second. The Cowboys, they're first. The Falcons, though, they're dead last. And guess what? Allen Robinson's only good game this year for fantasy purposes came against the Falcons. The Panthers this week are the Rams' second opponent with a pressure rate in the back half of the league. So we'll see what happens this weekend. I do think that Robinson can be dropped in a lot of leagues, though, because this isn't just all about situation and matchup. He's also not been good, but it's at least something to think about. The last question this week is another one from Patreon. It's from Chris. It says, new listeners, so my apologies if I've missed this on a prior episode. I've heard you talk about strategy to gain an edge in fantasy football. Can you expound on this a little bit more? Does the edge come from using specific metrics to identify trends, or does it come from drafting a specific way? Loving your work so far. Thank you. Thanks. So this is something that I talked about in a ton of depth in the late round draft guide. And one of the analogies that I used in that guide was with the video game Street Fighter. In Street Fighter, you go head to head against an opponent and use your character to knock out that opponent. You punch, you kick. It's a fighting game that I'm sure a lot of you listening to this, you've played it before. But there are also special moves that each character can do. And I'm really just referencing the older Street Fighter games here, by the way. I haven't played the newer ones that much. But you have these special moves that are harder to pull off than a regular punch or a kick. A player who's good at Street Fighter can continuously use those special moves to knock out their opponents. They can knock them out faster that way. An inexperienced player won't do that as much because it's harder to do. And what an inexperienced player does is they button mash. They just hit a bunch of buttons as fast as they can in order to beat their opponent, as opposed to taking their time to strategically throw a punch, throw a kick, or use a special move. You can sometimes still win when you button mash. Just like in fantasy football, you can still win when you go in without a draft strategy and you just pick the right players. But the strategic players, they're the ones who win more sustainably. Because there's a process and there's logic and there's reason behind the choices that they make. Strategy allows you to not just increase your chances of hitting on the right players, but it allows you to fall into the right players, even if you weren't high on them. It can help you avoid the right players too. I sort of think that someone's approach in fantasy football can be broken into two things: strategy and player evaluation. There's definitely some overlap there, but too many focus on the latter. They just focus on, this guy is good, this guy isn't good. But there's more to it than that. There's understanding market dynamics. There's understanding regression. There's having a process. You don't want to be a button masher. That's not sustainable. You want to crush your opponents with a Hadouken. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Remember to check out lateround.com. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening this week. I really appreciate it. Enjoy your weekend. Good luck in week 6. I'll talk to you next week.